My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 36 years old. On a Friday morning at 6:40, my sister called to tell me our father had died. He was sitting 2 feet from me, reaching across the table for sausage from my plate. I put her on speaker. "Nora, Dad passed away last night," Tessa said, her voice as flat as a receipt. "He left the house, the accounts, everything to Colin and me. You're getting nothing." Behind her, my brother-in-law Colin laughed. "At last, you're out." My father lowered his coffee, leaned toward the phone, and said something I'm not going to reveal yet. Tessa didn't hear it that morning. She heard it 2 days later in front of the entire town. What none of them knew was that the funeral they were already treating like an estate meeting would take place that Sunday, and my father had chosen the flowers himself. Lilies. My mother had hated lilies. Dad said she wouldn't mind missing this one. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, tell me where you're listening from. And stay with me, because this story gets much worse before it gets better. 8 months earlier, in September of 2027, my biggest problem was keeping up with a travel nursing schedule. I'm a registered nurse, and I was taking 12-week assignments out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. One contract in one state, the next somewhere else. The pay was the only reason a woman from a small town called Fairview could finish paying off nursing school before 40. My father thought the whole arrangement was ridiculous. "You cross half the country to hand strangers their medication," he used to say, "but I still can't convince you to check the oil in my truck." That was Harold Bennett. He was 76 that fall. He'd served in the Army from 1971 through 1975, then spent years repairing other people's cars before opening Bennett Auto on State Route 17. He ran that garage for 34 years, sold it in 2018, and retired at 68. He never left Fairview. The house on Willow Creek Lane was the same one he and my mother had bought in 1986 and paid off in 2011. Dad wasn't wealthy in the way people usually mean it. He didn't own expensive things or dress like a man with money. He was simply debt-free. In a small town, that kind of wealth stays invisible until someone starts looking through court records. My mother, Ellen, died in February of 2024. Dad handled grief the same way he handled broken engines, quietly and without asking anyone to watch. Every Saturday evening, he wound the small brass clock on the mantel because Mom always said a stopped clock made a home feel abandoned. He cooked for himself. He drove the 1981 Chevrolet pickup he had restored piece by piece. He called me every Sunday, and I called him back. We were close enough. At least, I thought we were. Then, on a clear September afternoon, Dad climbed a ladder to clean his own gutters. Asking for help had never been one of his strengths. He fell 7 feet and landed badly. His left wrist was fractured and required surgery, including a plate and several pins. The doctor expected 5 to 7 weeks of recovery. It wasn't life-threatening. It was supposed to be an inconvenience with a temporary metal repair. I was in the middle of a contract in Colorado, but I reached the hospital in Fairview within 36 hours. When I entered his room, Tessa was already there with flowers. Even her tears looked arranged. Colin was shaking the surgeon's hand as if they had just completed a business deal. Colin worked as a commercial mortgage broker. He had a smooth voice, an overly practiced handshake, and the habit of making every sentence sound reassuring. "Go back to your assignment," he told me, squeezing my shoulder. "We'll take care of the family stuff." At the time, I heard concern. Later, I understood that he was already deciding who would control the house. I asked the questions I always ask as a nurse. I wanted to see Dad's discharge instructions, his follow-up appointments, and his medication list. Colin smiled. "It's all organized," he said. "Everything's at the house." Tessa touched my arm. "We've got him, Nora. You're too far away to manage this." Dad was groggy from the medication but cheerful. He lifted his good hand and gave me a thumbs up. "Go on, kiddo. I'm surrounded by people who know what they're doing." So I went back to Colorado. I'm telling you that because it matters later. I didn't leave because I didn't love my father. I left because the two people closest to him kept insisting everything was under control. One of them had already decided what under control meant. Dad moved into Tessa and Colin's house in November. They said it would only be for a short time, maybe 10 days, until his cast came off and he could manage again. Their home was about 12 minutes from his own. That was when the first document appeared. It was legitimate. Dad's left hand was in a cast, so he couldn't write comfortably, pay bills, or drive. Colin arranged for a notary to come over, and Dad signed a limited power of attorney with his right hand. It covered paying bills and handling routine banking. That document was reasonable. It was legal. It was the kind of thing many people would sign for a family member after an injury. That was exactly why it worked. Nothing begins with an obvious crime. It begins with somebody offering to help. That week, Tessa posted a picture of Dad at her kitchen table with soup in front of him. The caption read, "Grateful I can care for my dad. Family comes first." Nearly 180 people reacted. Neighbors filled the comments with hearts. During a Sunday phone call, Colin explained their plans and referred to the house on Willow Creek Lane as the asset. I paused. "You mean Dad's house?" He laughed. "Sorry, mortgage language. I can't turn it off." Dad noticed things too, though he told me about them much later. Colin brought the power of attorney paperwork to Dad's bedside, instead of having him read it at the kitchen table. The pen was already uncapped. Dad's wrist hurt. The pain medication made him sluggish, and the document clearly said it was only for bills. He read it twice and signed. It was the last legitimate document they showed him. After that, a wall went up between us, one polite excuse at a time. My Sunday calls began going to Tessa instead of Dad. "He's sleeping. He's worn out. I'll tell him you called." For almost a month, I never heard my father's voice. His old flip phone supposedly broke, so I bought him a basic smartphone, set it up myself, saved my number, and mailed it to Tessa's house. The package disappeared. I sent another one with tracking. The delivery notice came through. "Oh, that," Tessa said. "Dad didn't want it. You know how he is with technology." My father had rebuilt a carburetor when he was 70. He was not frightened of a telephone. I knew something was wrong. I need to be clear about that. I asked to speak to him directly. I offered to arrange a video call. I asked which doctor was following his wrist so I could contact the office myself. Every time, I met the same soft resistance. "He's resting. We're handling it." Why are you acting suspicious? The problem is that when an adult is legally competent and the people providing care insist everything is fine, a daughter several states away has very few options. There's no agency you call simply because your sister keeps answering the phone. I was a contract nurse with student loans and a 12-week assignment I couldn't abandon without consequences. The only people inside that house kept smiling at me through the phone. One afternoon, Tessa ended the call by saying, "You chose your career, Nora. Let the people who stayed do the job." I went home for Christmas anyway. At that dinner, Dad's chair had been moved to the far corner of Tessa's living room. Christmas of 2027 came just after Dad turned 77. His cast was gone, but he seemed to have lost part of himself along with it. He sat quietly while Tessa answered questions that were directed at him. "Dad, how is the wrist?" "It's improving, right, Daddy?" He had lost weight. He barely spoke. His coffee was decaf because of doctor's orders, although none of his doctors had ever told him that. I managed to get him alone on the back porch for about 10 minutes. We both pretended we needed fresh air despite the temperature being 28 degrees. He looked at me with the old spark in his eyes. "My checkbook has gotten very thin, kiddo." I asked what he meant. "Statements used to come to the house," he said. "Now everything is electronic, and Colin keeps the passwords." Dad had asked to see the accounts twice. Both times, Colin had patted him on the shoulder and replied, "That's why you gave me the authority." When we went back inside, I calmly asked Tessa if all of us could sit down after the holidays and review Dad's finances together. Colin appeared from the hallway almost immediately. "There's no reason to bring lawyers into a family matter," he said, "unless you're accusing somebody." I had asked about bank statements. He had introduced the word lawyer. Then Tessa began crying about how much she did for Dad and how nobody appreciated the daughter who had remained nearby. Dad patted my arm. "I'm all right, Nora. Don't turn Christmas into a war." On January 9th, 2028, I signed another 12-week contract in Colorado. I had signed plenty of contracts in my life. That one would become the most expensive signature I ever put on paper. By February, even my Sunday calls felt scripted. I had reached the end of my patience, so I took 3 days off between shifts, told no one, and flew home. I thought I was bringing my father a surprise. Tessa opened the door looking startled, then recovered almost instantly. "Oh no, you just missed him." "Missed who?" "Dad. He left on an overnight fishing trip with some of the Legion guys." Terrible timing. Fishing in Pennsylvania in February made no sense, but she said it confidently. I drove to Dad's house on Willow Creek Lane and stood in the yard for a while. The grass was stiff with frost, the mailbox was full, and the curtains were closed. The house looked occupied by no one. On my way out of town, I stopped for gas and ran into Walter Keene, Dad's oldest friend. Walter had run Keene Funeral Home for 35 years before his sons took over. He had buried most of Fairview and knew almost everyone's family history. He studied my face. "Harold hasn't attended a Legion meeting in 4 months, he said. "We assumed he moved in with you." "He's not at the meetings?" "Not with us. Not lately." I called Tessa from the gas station parking lot. She didn't hesitate. "He has other friends, Nora. You don't know everybody he spends time with." It was one false answer placed neatly on top of another. I returned to Colorado with a knot in my stomach. 2 days later, Tessa sent me a photograph of Dad sitting in an armchair, smiling weakly. "Dad is doing fine. Please stop checking on us." I stared at that picture for a long time. There was a small detail in the background that meant nothing to me then. 3 months later, it would change how I understood every picture she had sent. My contract ended during the first week of May. I returned to Harrisburg with one plan: drive to Fairview without warning and refuse to leave until I saw my father. The phone rang before I had finished unpacking. It was Mara Ellison, a nurse I had worked with years earlier. She was 55, sharp, observant, and careful about what she said. She had recently taken a job at a long-term care facility called Briar Glen Lodge, near the West Virginia border, about 180 miles from my apartment. "Nora," she said, "there's a resident here who keeps asking every nurse on every shift whether they know a nurse named Nora. He says she's his daughter." I couldn't answer. Mara continued in the same professional voice. "His name is Harold Bennett. Is he your father?" I was standing in my kitchen with my keys still in my hand. No one had ever mentioned a nursing facility. Not once. According to everything Tessa had told me, Dad was eating dinner 12 minutes from his house. Mara added one more thing. "He doesn't seem like someone who was properly placed. He seems like someone who was left somewhere." I didn't call Tessa. I didn't call Colin. Some conversations belong on the phone. Others require daylight, paperwork, and the person sitting in front of you. I got in the car. If you have an aging parent, ask them today, calmly, who controls their power of attorney and whether they've seen their own bank statement recently. It isn't an accusation. It's basic awareness. I waited too long to ask, and my father lost almost everything except his life. And if this story feels familiar, take a moment to subscribe. You'll want to hear what Harold did once he got out. The drive took nearly 3 hours. I spent every mile thinking like a nurse, because if I had driven there only as a daughter, I might not have made it safely. Briar Glen Lodge sat off a county road behind a sign with one burned-out letter. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell of inexpensive disinfectant covering something older. A call light blinked down the hall while no one moved toward it. A television played for a row of empty chairs. I counted staff automatically. One aide was covering a wing that needed at least 4. At 10:30 in the morning, the locked medication cart still showed the 8:30 medications as pending. I wasn't blaming the aides. Understaffed workers can't create time that isn't there. I'm telling you what I saw because my father had been living in that building for 10 weeks while my sister told everyone that family came first. Dad was in a shared room at the end of the West Hall, in the 3rd bed beside a window that wouldn't open. The man who had once carried an engine block across a garage floor out of pure stubbornness was thinner by about 12 pounds. He had gray stubble and wore a shirt I had never seen before. It hung on him like somebody else's clothing. But when the door opened, his eyes lifted immediately. They were still clear. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You finally made it, kiddo." That hurt more than crying would have. "They told me you knew I was here," he continued. "They said you approved it." They hadn't just kept him from me. They had convinced each of us that the other had agreed to everything. We spent the next hour sorting through nearly 8 months of carefully arranged lies. His flip phone had not broken. Tessa had taken it away, claiming she was protecting him from scam callers. Neither smartphone had ever reached him. I had sent 5 letters, and none had made it beyond whoever collected the mail. In March, Colin told Dad he needed to leave his house for 10 days while the guest room floor was repaired. 10 days passed. Whenever Dad asked when he could go home, Colin's answers became shorter. Eventually, the next place Dad saw was Briar Glen Lodge, where he was assigned a roommate named Leon, who shouted at the ceiling after dark. All the while, they told him I knew about it. They said I was too busy with work and couldn't be bothered with my own father. Dad had kept a torn piece of an envelope in his wallet. My old cell number was written on it in pencil. It was the only number they hadn't been able to remove. The hall phone required staff to place outside calls, and staff were rarely available. I did what I do at work. I asked Dad the date, the month, and who was president. I had him count backward from 100 by 7s. He rolled his eyes. "It's Tuesday. I'm in a bad afterlife, and your little test is easier than one of Colin's mortgage speeches." His mind was completely intact. That fact was about to become very important. Then he glanced at the door and lowered his voice. "Nora, whatever paperwork they used to bring me here, I never signed another form." I went to the front office with my nursing credentials ready and my professional voice in place. The administrator was an exhausted man in a beige tie. He repeated the explanation he had clearly been given. "Only the responsible party can authorize a transfer," he said. "That's Mr. Voss. He holds the power of attorney." I asked one question. "Does my father have any diagnosis of dementia, cognitive impairment, or incapacity?" The administrator clicked through the file. There was no such diagnosis. Dad had been admitted voluntarily based on paperwork submitted by Colin, along with a vague letter saying he needed assistance with daily activities. "A competent adult isn't property you can store," I told him. "He can discharge himself." He started to respond, so I added, "Or we can call the long-term care ombudsman and review the intake file together. I have the rest of the afternoon." Paperwork appears surprisingly quickly when someone offers to read it with a state official. 25 minutes later, Dad sat at the front desk and signed his own discharge papers. His left wrist had healed, and his right hand moved steadily across the page. "The first thing I've signed in 6 months," he said. "Feels like escaping prison." Mara hugged him at the door and slipped a packet of cookies from the staff room into his jacket. The facility would notify Colin by certified mail. "Fine," I said. "The mail can take its time." During the drive home, Dad watched the fields pass by. "They think I've been put away somewhere," he said quietly. "Let's leave them with that idea for a little longer." I set him up in my apartment in Harrisburg. He slept on the pull-out couch, his prescriptions were refilled, and I made him real coffee with caffeine. Then we went to the bank. Harold was still the account holder, which meant he had the right to request his own statements. The printout was 9 pages long. He read it the way he used to read a mechanic's report, slowly, twice, without swearing. Between November and March, $192,000 had left his accounts. About $45,000 was labeled as care expenses for a man who had been eating powdered potatoes at Briar Glen. Another $91,000 had been wired to a company called CV Holdings LLC. The initials were Collins. The remaining $56,000 had gone to a lender connected to the Florida condo Tessa and Colin bought in 2023. Only $22,000 was still in Dad's accounts. His entire quiet savings had been drained in a few months. Stapled behind the statements was something even worse, a pending home equity application for $135,000 against the Willow Creek house, signed Harold Bennett and dated April 18th. On April 18th, Dad had been 180 miles away at Briar Glen Lodge, asking nurses whether they knew his daughter. I called Tessa that night. I gave her one opportunity to explain, and I kept my voice calm. "Tell me what happened from your side. I'm listening." Her answer told me exactly how far she had gone. "You were never really part of this family, Nora. Don't criticize the person who stayed." After that, we stopped asking family members for explanations. We hired Elaine Mercer, an elder law attorney who was 64 and seemed to view paperwork as a personal language. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had a handshake that felt final. Her office smelled faintly of toner and lemon drops. She listened without interrupting, then looked at Dad. "Documents don't get emotional, Mr. Bennett. That makes them useful." She moved quickly and stayed within the law. First, Dad signed a notarized revocation of every power of attorney on record. Copies went to the bank, the county recorder, and every institution that had received one. Second, Elaine sent a signature dispute letter to Harborline Lending, freezing the home equity application. No money had been released, so the house was still safe. Third, she filed a report with Adult Protective Services and submitted a fraud affidavit to the bank. Those actions started official investigations that Colin couldn't delay with a friendly phone call. Then, Elaine explained the difficult part. "I can pursue the money through civil recovery," she said. "Criminal intent is harder. Colin will claim your father approved the transfers verbally. People like him always say that." Buried in the bank's records was something we hadn't known about, a second power of attorney, this one granting full financial authority. It had been notarized on January 14th and submitted later that month. Dad had never signed it. Elaine placed the document on the desk. "For criminal charges, it helps if they use that forged signature again in a public setting with witnesses," she said. "A forged document hidden in a file can become a lawsuit. A forged document presented in front of a room full of people can become a conviction." Dad studied the page for a long time. The signature looked neat and careful, but it was not his. Then he looked at me. "Bring me my Army discharge papers." The following Tuesday, we drove to Fairview while Colin was at his office, selling someone a 30-year financial promise. My key still worked in the back door of the Willow Creek house. That oversight turned out to be useful. Inside, the air was stale. The file drawers in the den had been left open and searched. My mother's suitcase sat unzipped on the guest bed, and the jewelry box beside it was empty. On the mantel, Ellen's brass clock had stopped at some unknown time. No one had wound it in 8 months. Dad stood in the living room. "The place doesn't even smell like mine anymore." He went into the bedroom, knelt carefully, and pulled his old Army footlocker from beneath the bed. It was still locked. That was the one thing Colin hadn't managed to open. Inside were Dad's discharge papers, carrying the original signature he had written in 1975. There was also the deed to the house, his medals wrapped in a handkerchief, and an envelope marked in my mother's handwriting. "For Harold, when I can't say it myself." Dad didn't open that envelope there. He carried the footlocker into the kitchen and set it on the table where my parents had made every major family decision. Then he placed the forged power of attorney beside his discharge papers. He became very quiet. The real signature had the same habits Dad had carried for decades. The H leaned forward, the last letter stretched too far, and the ink pressed deep into the page. The forged signature was rounded and careful. Every letter looked too polite. Dad tapped it. Even before I hurt my wrist, I never wrote my name that neatly. But the handwriting wasn't the strongest evidence. The date was. I had already obtained his medical records. The day after leaving Briar Glen, Dad had signed a release making me his healthcare contact. On January 14th, he had been at the orthopedic clinic from 8:45 in the morning until 11:15, undergoing a hardware check under light sedation. A medical assistant had initialed his chart throughout the appointment. The power of attorney claimed it had been notarized at 9:55 that morning in an office 18 miles away. A sedated patient could not be signing documents in another town. The paper contradicted itself. Dad leaned back. His grief seemed to give way to something more deliberate. "Someone who is dead can't sign his name," he said. "Their notary stamped a ghost. We'll let everybody meet it." He finally opened my mother's letter by the window and read it alone. When he returned to the table, he shared only one sentence. "Your mother wrote that quiet people can still be strong. She told me never to surrender my voice." That Friday, the certified letter from Briar Glen reached the Voss mailbox. My phone began ringing before noon. Colin's first voicemail had lost all its warmth. "You removed an elderly person from a care facility without authorization. That is kidnapping." His third message threatened an emergency guardianship petition. Dad was confused, declining, and being controlled by a daughter who wanted his money. It was almost impressive. He accused me of the exact conduct he had been carrying out. Elaine remained calm. "Guardianship requires an independent medical evaluation. Your father will pass it easily." Then she told us what a guardianship fight would really do. It could take weeks, become public, damage everyone's reputation, and, most importantly, buy Colin time. If the frozen loan application became active again, or if he managed to move the remaining funds, the delay would help him. Men like Colin didn't always fight to win. Sometimes they fought to keep the clock running. That night, Tessa sent me a text. "Dad will choose us. He always needs the daughter who stayed. You have your career and an empty apartment. Eventually, he'll understand which of us built a life around him." I showed it to Dad because we had agreed that no one would manage information on his behalf again. He read it, looked toward the window, and answered quietly. "She thinks being nearby is the same thing as being loyal." Then he handed the phone back. "Call Walter. Tell him I'm ready to ask for the favor he's owed me since 1978. At 9 that night, Dad sat at my kitchen table with a cup of decaf he had poured for himself as a joke. "They need me incapacitated or dead," he said. "Guardianship is the slow public route. Let's give them the other possibility." I laughed at first, then realized he was serious. He wanted Tessa and Colin to believe he had died. Not a false death certificate, not a report to the government, not an insurance claim, not an obituary, just a private phone call, a community memorial, and the chance for two greedy people to reveal what they had already prepared. "I checked," Dad said. "Allowing dishonest people to misunderstand a private conversation isn't a crime." Elaine's legal reasoning sat underneath the plan. If Tessa and Colin believed Dad was gone, greed would push them to produce the forged will immediately. They would present it in front of witnesses because they wouldn't want to wait for probate or answer questions later. Their own documents would expose them. I worried about what would happen if the plan failed. If this goes wrong, they'll call me unstable. They'll use it against Dad in the guardianship case. Dad nodded. "I've been called worse by people I respected less." For a moment, he looked decades younger. "We only need one person the town will believe," he said. "Fortunately, I know the man who has buried half of it." Walter listened to the entire plan on his back porch, holding a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand. When Dad finished, Walter said nothing for about 6 seconds. For Walter, that was practically a speech. "I've announced the deaths of 4 mayors and 1 man I disliked," he finally said. "This will be my first practice run." That was how Walter agreed. He had spent decades running a funeral home, and people in 2 counties trusted his word about a death. His sons operated the business now, but no one in Fairview would question Walter Keene calling with sad news. He would make one personal call to Tessa. He would say that Harold had collapsed and died. Every word could later be dismissed as an old man misunderstanding a conversation, and none of it would involve an official record. Mara's part was simpler. If anyone called Briar Glen asking for Harold, she would state only what was technically true. "Mr. Bennett is no longer with us here." The American Legion Post would hold a memorial that Sunday, organized by Dad's old friends, just as they had done for other veterans over the years. Elaine would know nothing officially. She would attend as a community member with her briefcase, the way she carried it everywhere. If documents happened to be displayed in public, she would be there with the genuine ones. Walter asked one final question. "What flowers?" "Lilies," Dad replied. "Ellen hated them. She won't mind missing this one." I know some of you are thinking we should have gone straight to court. We could have. We probably would have won eventually, quietly, after years of hearings and paperwork. But Dad wanted the town to see who Tessa and Colin were while they were still standing in the room. If you've ever watched a charming person fool everyone around them, you understand why that mattered. Stay with me. The memorial is where everything finally broke open. Thursday evening at 7, Walter made the call from his porch. Dad and I listened from a few feet away. My father was attending the announcement of his own death with his arms folded, as if he were reviewing an estimate. Walter's voice changed the way it always did when he delivered bad news. "Tessa, it's Walter Keene. I'm calling about your father. He collapsed this evening. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, but Harold is gone." Then came the pause. Tessa did not ask whether Dad had suffered. She didn't ask where he was or whether she could see him. Her first question was, where was he staying? Was he carrying anything? Papers, I mean. Did he have any documents with him? Dad's hand tightened once around his coffee cup. Walter continued smoothly. "The Post will handle the arrangements. We're holding a memorial Sunday at the Legion Hall, and there won't be any cost to the family. As for paperwork, I imagine an attorney has whatever needs to be handled." Tessa thanked him in a voice that sounded like it was already calculating. She never asked to see her father. Later, we checked the phone records. 26 minutes after Walter ended the call, Colin phoned Harborline Lending and left a message asking how soon the money could be released. Apparently, grief operated according to business hours. That brings us back to Friday morning. At 6:40, my kitchen smelled like breakfast. Tessa's name appeared on my phone. I put her on speaker and placed the phone beside our coffee. "Nora, Dad died last night," she said. Her voice held no sadness. "He left everything to Colin and me. You received nothing." Colin was close enough to the phone for me to hear him. "Finally, you're free of this." I understood then that she wasn't calling to tell me someone had died. She was announcing that I had been expelled from the family, from the inheritance, and from the version of events they intended to tell everyone else. My father set down his mug. He leaned toward the phone. My thumb rested over the mute button. I had kept it there from the start because we needed the trap to remain in place for 2 more days. Dad said something in a low, steady voice, but Tessa didn't hear it. I told my sister I needed time and would attend the memorial on Sunday. Before hanging up, she gave me one last instruction. "Don't bring an attorney to a funeral, Nora. Have some respect." I answered, "Understood." They had all of Saturday to behave exactly as they always did. By 9 that morning, Tessa had posted a black and white photograph of Dad on social media. "Rest peacefully, Daddy. I was beside you until the end." By lunchtime, more than 180 people had reacted. Neighbors promised casseroles. Women from my mother's church sent candle emojis. Beside you until the end of what? His bank account? That was when I understood the photograph Tessa had sent me in February. It showed Dad in the same chair against the same wall. A clock in the background read 4:12. The memorial picture showed that identical clock at 4:12, and Dad wore the same shirt. Every photograph she had sent me as proof that he was fine had come from one afternoon, one staged scene, cropped and saved for later. Dad had been gone from that house since March. The pictures just hadn't revealed it. While Tessa posted online, Colin was working in person. A neighbor named Mabel Crane, who had lived on Willow Creek Lane for more than 40 years, called me sounding confused. "There's a van at your father's place," she said. "A man is changing the locks." It was Saturday, before the memorial, and they were securing a dead man's house before they had even buried him. Elaine added Mabel's call and its time to the evidence folder. Mara called next. Someone had contacted Briar Glen, asking for records for the estate. Dad's body wasn't even cold, mostly because it was sitting at my kitchen table eating a ham sandwich. He took the reports without much reaction. That evening, he polished his good shoes and hung his dark suit over the door. "Every man should look decent at his own funeral," he said. Sunday afternoon brought 54 folding chairs to the American Legion Hall. Flags hung at the front, and the old honor board displayed the names of veterans from Fairview. The wooden floor creaked whenever someone shifted. Walter had arranged a closed casket at the front. It came from the funeral home showroom, and no one questioned it. People tend not to question a closed casket. There was a photograph of Dad in uniform from 1973, and lilies everywhere. The town came. Legion members in their caps, neighbors from Willow Creek Lane, and women from Ellen's church carrying covered dishes. Mara sat near the back. Elaine took a chair in the corner with her briefcase resting on her knees. Dad and I were behind the stage in a storage room. Through the narrow gap near the door, we could see the hall. I held the folder containing the real documents. My hands were cold. Dad's were steady. Tessa arrived dressed like a grieving widow in a brand new black dress and new shoes. She cried whenever people were looking and composed herself as soon as they turned away. Colin wore his best suit. He greeted people, accepted condolences, and kept his own folder tucked beneath his arm. They took the first row. At 2:30, Walter stepped to the podium. "Before we share memories of Harold," he said, "the family has asked to address some matters concerning his estate." They had requested that part themselves that morning. Colin walked up to the microphone as if the podium had been reserved for him. "Harold believed in family," he began. He wanted his wishes respected. Then he removed a document from the folder. It was printed on cream-colored paper with a blue cover. "Harold signed a new will this past April. It leaves the Willow Creek property, his bank accounts, and his truck to Tessa and me. The document is dated April 24th, 2028. The room shifted. 54 chairs moved at once as people straightened and looked around. Mabel muttered, "That doesn't sound like Harold," in the same tone she used when discussing spoiled tomatoes or bad neighbors. Colin should have stopped there. He never did. He raised one hand for quiet, found me standing at the back wall, and continued reading. "And to my daughter Nora I leave nothing, for reasons she already understands." He delivered that sentence as though he were announcing a fact, not using a dead man's supposed cruelty to impress a room full of his friends. His smile made the lie worse. Elaine opened the clasps on her briefcase. Walter leaned toward the microphone. "April 24th, he said gently. "That's an unusual date for a signature." The side door clicked. "Before I tell you what happened next, I need to take you back to Saturday night. Near midnight, Dad and I had spread the documents across my kitchen table like parts from an engine. My old instinct, the one that makes me believe I have to prevent every possible disaster, had surfaced again. "We can give everything to the police Monday," I said. "No performance, no risk." Dad was quiet for a moment. Then he answered without anger. Tessa told you that you were getting nothing. Let's see how that nothing looks when it walks into the room. He told me the real reason he wanted the memorial. They didn't just take my money, he said. Money can be earned again. I built my savings once with a wrench in my hand. They took my voice. They told the town I needed to be put away. They told my daughter I didn't want her. They told me my own mind was useless. He looked at the papers on the table. At my age, my word is what I have left. I'm taking it back in front of the people they lied to. That was the entire purpose of the plan. We set the rules. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, no speeches from us. I would carry the bank records, the revocation, the medical records, and Dad's discharge papers. Then we would let the documents speak, because documents had been their weapon from the beginning. At 2:30 Sunday afternoon, the light came through the narrow gap around the side door. Dad turned the knob. The shortest resurrection in Pennsylvania history was about to begin. He stepped into the hall wearing a dark suit, polished shoes, and his Legion pin. He didn't hurry. Harold Bennett had never hurried for anyone, and he wasn't about to start at his own memorial. The hall reacted all at once. A casserole dish slid from a side table and broke. One of the churchwomen crossed herself and sat down hard. An oxygen tank whistled near the back. Mara let out one sharp laugh before covering her mouth. Mabel said, "Well, I'll be," loud enough for everyone to hear. Tessa stood up and stopped moving. She had gone white beneath the lilies. Mascara ran down her cheeks, but her face no longer seemed capable of producing the expression she had practiced. Colin froze at the podium. The forged will was still raised in his right hand, visible to all 54 people in the room, including Elaine. Dad reached the microphone and lowered it with 2 fingers. He glanced at the casket. "Nice box, Walter. A little too much room for me." Then he looked at Colin. "Someone who has died can't sign documents, and he certainly can't sit here drinking coffee." Colin immediately began shouting, "This is a sick joke. He isn't competent. Look at him. He wandered away from the facility. Nora has manipulated him. She took him because she wants the money. This is exactly why we were going to seek guardianship." It was strange watching him try to sell that story after everyone had watched Dad walk across the hall. The room didn't murmur in agreement. It became quiet in a different way, the way people grow quiet when they stop listening as an audience and start judging as a jury. Tessa reached for sympathy. "Daddy, Walter told us." Then she turned on Walter. "You lied to me. You told me he was gone." She had been told her father had died, and she had never once asked to see him. She hadn't called the funeral home. She hadn't asked how he died. She had only prepared a speech and brought a folder. I walked down the center aisle. "You were told Dad collapsed," I said. "At 6:40 the next morning you called me about the inheritance. You never asked to see him, not once." Behind me, the pastor from Ellen's old church stood, took his coat, and moved several rows away from the Voss family. The room had made its choice. Elaine rose from her chair and buttoned her jacket. "Mr. Voss," she said, "may I examine the document you just read?" What followed took 9 minutes. I had never enjoyed paperwork more. Elaine walked to the front table and placed each document down in order. First, a notarized revocation of every power of attorney, signed by Mr. Bennett in June and filed with the county and his financial institutions. She placed another document beside it. Second, the orthopedic records from January 14th. Mr. Bennett was at the clinic from 8:45 until 11:15 under light sedation, with staff initials throughout the appointment. The power of attorney Mr. Voss relied on claims it was notarized at 9:55 that morning, 18 miles away. She looked directly at Colin. A sedated man cannot sign a document in another town. Next came the bank records. Third, $192,000 removed from Mr. Bennett's accounts over 5 months. That includes $91,000 sent to CV Holdings, LLC. She glanced up. The C stands for Colin. I assume the V does not stand for victim. Several people looked toward Colin. Elaine continued. Fourth, a $135,000 home equity application against the Willow Creek property, dated April 18th, when Mr. Bennett was living at Briar Glen Lodge, 180 miles from the lender's office. Then she picked up the will. And finally, this will, dated April 24th, while Mr. Bennett was still at Briar Glen. Facility records show he had no visitors that week. She turned toward Colin. Who witnessed this document? There were 2 witness signatures. One belonged to a loan officer from Colin's office. That man was sitting in the 3rd row with a casserole on his knees. He turned the color of oatmeal. You told me it was ordinary estate paperwork, he said to Colin. You said it was just a formality. He had come to pay respects and was now identifying himself as a witness to a forgery. Colin's last defense arrived quickly. No one agreed to be recorded. You set me up. Elaine didn't raise her voice. No one recorded you, Mr. Voss. You read the document into a microphone at a memorial where you personally requested speaking time. Then the hall doors opened. 3 county deputies entered from the afternoon light. Elaine had coordinated their arrival with the fraud unit 4 days earlier. Nobody was thrown to the ground. Nobody was handcuffed in front of the lilies. Real life is often quieter than television, and that can make it worse. The older deputy walked to the front. Mr. Voss, we need you to answer questions about a bank fraud report and several documents. The bank had already frozen the line of credit and referred the matter for federal investigation. I watched Colin's expressions change. First came outrage. This is a family issue. Then charm. Gentlemen, there's been a misunderstanding. We can discuss this privately. When neither worked, the last mask appeared. He turned toward Dad. Harold, I'm family. I was going to repay it. Every dollar. It was an investment. I was trying to grow the money for you. Dad looked at him the way he used to inspect an engine that had been misrepresented. You had access to my accounts for 8 months, he said. The only thing you managed to grow was my funeral. The hall released one collective breath. Then Tessa broke down. She dropped into the front row chair, and for one brief moment, the performance disappeared. We were drowning, Daddy, she said quietly. The condo, the credit cards, everything. Colin said it was temporary. It was supposed to be temporary. I believed him. I still believe it probably did begin that way. A desperate decision, a promise to put the money back. But her next sentence destroyed whatever sympathy remained. She turned toward me, tears still on her face. You made everything worse, Nora. If you had stayed out of it, nobody would ever have found out. There it was. Not an apology, not regret, only anger that the theft had been exposed. I looked at my sister, the girl who had taught me to ride a bicycle, fixed my hair for prom, and then called me at 6:40 to tell me I would inherit nothing. I kept my voice calm. You told me before breakfast that I was getting nothing. I'm the only person leaving this room with exactly what I brought in. The deputies escorted Colin up the aisle. He was still trying to explain interest rates to men wearing badges. Dad stepped to the microphone one final time and placed his hand against the borrowed casket. Everyone, forgive the unusual rehearsal, he said. You needed to see this. Not because I'm important, but because someday it may be your house, your children, or your paperwork. Look at those documents while you're still here to question them. The pastor said, Amen. It was probably the proudest church moment of Dad's life. Outside, the parking lot filled with late sunlight and gravel. The deputies placed Colin in the first county vehicle. Before the door closed, he was already asking when he could make a phone call. Tessa walked toward the second car on her own. She wasn't arrested that afternoon, but the deputies had questions. Her new shoes caught in the gravel, and the sharp clicking became uneven. At the car door, she stopped and turned around. For the first time that day, she looked at Dad instead of at what he owned. Dad walked over slowly and stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform for the people coming out of the hall. He simply said what he had whispered beside me at 6:41 Friday morning. "You held the wrong funeral, sweetheart." Tessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The deputy closed the door. Through the glass, Colin was still talking rapidly about lawyers and misunderstandings. I stepped beside Dad and called after him. "You were right about one thing, Colin. Someone is finally out." The cars pulled away. Walter appeared at Dad's shoulder holding 2 cups of church coffee. He surveyed the empty lot. "Best service I've ever conducted," he said. 9 out of 10. I'd do it again." Dad gave a short snort. He removed the lily boutonniere Walter had pinned to his suit and placed it on the casket before it was wheeled back into the van. "Give those to someone who actually needs a funeral," he said. "I've got a house to reopen." That evening, we changed the locks on Willow Creek with a locksmith we chose ourselves. We kept the invoice and the receipt. In this family, we keep records now. Dad walked straight to the mantel. Before removing his suit jacket, he wound Ellen's brass clock. The ticking returned. The house felt occupied again. Here's what happened afterward. Colin was charged with 2 counts of forgery, the power of attorney and the will, along with theft from an elderly person and falsifying a loan application. The state licensing board suspended his mortgage license within 3 weeks and revoked it by winter. In his profession, that was practically a professional death notice. CV Holdings LLC was dissolved by a court-appointed receiver. Between bank restitution and money recovered from the company, Dad received $146,000 of the $192,000 that had been taken. The home equity application was canceled before any funds were released. The house remained untouched. Elaine placed the rest of Dad's property into a living trust with protections Colin couldn't bypass. Tessa accepted a plea agreement. She received 2 years of probation, a restitution schedule, and 240 hours of community service at a nursing facility. Every Saturday, she emptied bedpans and read to residents whose families rarely visited. People ask whether I forgave my sister. 8 weeks later, I saw her through the glass partition at the county probation office. She looked smaller without makeup. "Did you come here to gloat?" she asked. "No," I said, and I meant it. I handed an envelope to the officer. Inside was a copy of Mom's letter from the footlocker. At the bottom, Dad had written one line in pencil. "Your mother told us not to disappear into silence. That includes you." Tessa read it twice. Something shifted across her face, something I hadn't seen since before Colin entered our lives. I don't know what she does with that feeling. That part is hers. What I gave her was a boundary, not forgiveness. "When the restitution is paid and you've done the work honestly, you know where I live," I told her. "Until then, you get exactly what you offered me that morning." She nodded. It was the first honest agreement we had made in years. Dad returned to the American Legion every Thursday. He and Walter also started a monthly meeting called Paperwork Before You Need It. They set up a folding table, poured free coffee, and taught people how to read a power of attorney, how to notice a signature that looked wrong, and how to verify that the will in a drawer actually belonged to them. 9 people came to the first meeting. By the third, they needed extra chairs. A woman from the next town told Dad the meetings had made her take a closer look at her nephew's handling of her accounts. I accepted a permanent nursing position at a Harrisburg hospital. No more 12-week assignments across the country. Every Sunday, I make the 2.5-hour drive to Fairview. Dad burns the breakfast sausage on purpose because he insists that's how I prefer it. Being present isn't something you repay once. It's something you keep choosing. The brass clock still works on the mantel, and in his wallet, where the torn envelope with my number used to be, Dad now carries one pressed lily. "Best funeral I never had," he says. "My father taught me that a man's value isn't measured by the amount in his account. It's measured by whether his word still matters while he's alive, and whether the people who claim to love him protect his signature instead of waiting to inherit it." That's my story. One phone call at 6:40, one forged signature, and one old soldier who stood up at his own funeral. If this reminds you to check your parents' paperwork or your own, do it this week while everyone is still here. And if your family has ever turned greed into betrayal, share your story in the comments.